This learning module is about units of measure and numbers in general in Japan, both modern Japan and traditional Japan. I'd like to start by pointing out something that Webb also points out, and that is that when we talk about units of measure, we're dealing with two important variables. The first one is time. The traditional measures used in Japan prior to the 20th century underwent a general evolution over time. In other words, it's not a safe assumption that a measure used in one period, say the Heian period, was precisely the same as the same measure as what we call it used in another period. So, for example, a ken in the Heian period may not be equal to a ken in the Tokugawa period. Length and weight measures were particularly subject to slight variation over time, and we see this in the West also. So an inch in the 7th century is not necessarily going to be the same as an inch in the 17th century, because there's different authorities that are establishing what those units of measurement are. The second important variable is place. Japan had a complex relationship between the national and local levels of its society, and as a result, there were often differences between the uses of a measure between different regions. As we'll see, for example, an area of measure, tatami mat, differs in Tokyo from that we'd see, for example, in Kyoto. So in the Kyoto area, a tatami measures 0.955 meters by 1.91 meters. But a tatami in Nagoya measures 0.91 by 1.82. And in Tokyo, it measures 0.88 by 1.76. So it's the smallest in Tokyo, which I suppose isn't too much of a surprise because space is really at a premium in Tokyo. So that's true even today, not just in pre-modern Japan. Now, why bother learning about traditional units of measure? Even now, when Japan has adopted the metric system for official measurements, I'll say more about that in a minute, traditional measures remain in use. And to give you an analogy, although in the international arena the British use the metric system, at home they still refer to distance in miles, etc., or inches or yards. So that traditional system remains in everyday conversation and everyday parlance, and a familiarity with it will help you get along in Japan. Just to continue that analogy, let's say you're reading a British novel and you read about people paying money, and the words are they paid a bob or a shilling or a quid or a pence. If you don't know what those terms mean, then the importance of the price or the literal value of the price is lost on you. You can still understand the story, but it really helps if you're familiar with those traditional measurements. On the Japan side, if you read about something being 3 ken tall in Japan, then the import will be lost on you if you don't know what a ken is. So there's a really good argument for becoming familiar with these measurements, not necessarily memorizing them, but recognizing them if you read them, and then knowing where to look to find out what that distance is. That traditional system of measurement is called the shakkan hole. The name shakkan hole originates from the name of two of the units. The shaku, which is a unit of length, and the kan, which is a measurement of mass. And the hole just means a system, a set of rules. From 1924, the shakkan hole system began to be replaced in Japan by the metric system, and use of the old units for official purposes was forbidden after March 1966. But that's official purposes, not everyday household usage. So there's still several instances in which the old system is still used, and I'll be giving you a few examples of that. What you see on your screen here on this slide is a postage stamp that was issued in 1959 to commemorate the full adaptation of the metric system. There are lots of detailed conversion charts online. There's a link to one on Blackboard, and you'll need that for the homework. You might want to bookmark it. It's quite a handy site. Appendix 12 of Nelson's also has equivalent weights and measures, so you can look at that. I don't want to go through all the traditional measurements, so I'm just going to look at length and area as a sample. Here's the chart from Nelson's, from the appendix in Nelson's, and it gives us the linear measure in the traditional system on the left here, and then the English system and the metric system. So you can see on this chart that you have, as you would expect, I think, small divisions, and then eventually they get larger and larger. One of the measurements that I run into often is this one, the D. And you need to be careful about a D because a D in Japan is 2.44 miles, but the Chinese, for example, use that same kanji to refer to a much different measurement, a much smaller measurement, less than half that length, if I recall correctly. So I guess that goes back to the geography issue. Even outside of Japan, those particular units of measure are going to differ, and so you have to keep that in mind. In carpentry and agriculture, use of that old-fashioned system, that traditional system, is still pretty common. So here we have an advertisement for some planers that you would use, that a carpenter might use. And in carpentry, those traditional measurements are still applied. So they give you the metric equivalent in case you're not sure what it is, but these are sold by size in the traditional system, as you see here. Here's another example. This is a calligraphy brush, and we're told it's the length of the bristles here. Now I should say, sort of as an aside, I get this question often from my more advanced Japanese language students, and that is, what if you're translating a text and it uses those traditional measurements, and you end up with something that's really kind of awkward. So the original text says, oh, it was 3 li away, and you figure out, well, that would be 7.6 something something. Are you, when you're translating, do you do it precisely? And my answer is, well, it's really up to you as a translator. If you're trying to maintain the flow of the text, you can come up with a rough equivalent, cut off the decimal, cut off a fraction. It's probably best to translate it into a familiar Western measurement, for example, miles, if you're dealing with the D. That's better than simply saying, oh, it was 5D away, because your reader who's picking up that English text, that English translation of a Japanese text, is probably not going to be familiar with the traditional measurements and not going to have the patience to read a footnote. Besides, in translation, usually footnotes are quite frowned upon. So you have to use a little bit of artistic license. Here is that chart from Nelson's, from the same appendix, that gives us area, or square measure. Again, on the left-hand side, we have the traditional units of measure, and then the British system and the so-called British system, or English system, and the metric system here on the right. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are certainly the most common units of measure that you might see in a text. So if you're ever looking for an apartment in Japan, even today, there's another argument for learning what these measurements are. The most useful unit of measure you should know is the jo, and there's two different kanji that can be used to write that word. That's the area of a tatami mat, and I was just explaining how we have different sizes depending on where you are in Japan. So that affects your interpretation of how big a jo is, how big a tatami mat is, but as an average, it's about 90 centimeters by 180 centimeters. And indeed, if you look at real estate listings, you'll discover that apartment rooms, house rooms, anything are always described in terms of how many jo they are, even if there are no tatami mat in sight. It can be what they call a Western room, and yet its measurement is given not in square meters, but in tatami, because that's the common unit of measure that people are familiar with. Let me show you an example. Here's an ad for an apartment. And at the top here, it tells us this is a Western style room, and the Western style room is 5.1 tatami mats big. This is the living, dining, kitchen area. That's what LDK stands for, and it's 9.6 tatami mats. And then they don't give the tatami size for the bathroom or the balcony or the closet, but this is a pretty common way of describing the size of any living area. You might be interested to know that in traditional Japanese architecture, the most common size of a room is 6 mats. And then sort of the next size you might expect would be 4 mats. Next size down, maybe 4 mats. If you have a room that's 8 mats or 9 mats, that's pretty big. And here we see 9.6. That's a pretty big space for a Japanese apartment. Where else do we see these traditional measurements? Well, we see them in the kitchen. A go is a measurement of uncooked rice, or a measurement of sake. It's a volume measurement. When you buy a rice cooker these days, usually it comes with a few accoutrements, including the shamuji down here, the rice paddle. And it usually also comes with a little plastic cup. Most people I know sort of set that cup aside and ignore it. Certainly my mother did that. She had no idea what it was in there for. But that cup is a go. It measures a go of rice. And it's not the same as an American cup or a British cup. An American cup is 250 milliliters. And a go is a smaller amount, but this is a traditional measurement. And actually, on the inside of your rice cooker, there are probably gradations. It'll say 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's for measuring the water for the rice. But the assumption there is that 1 is 1 go, not 1 American cup. And the assumption is also that you're cooking Japanese rice, but we won't go there. So a go is still very commonly used in Japan. I remember my host mother would often ask me to get the rice started, wash the rice, and get the rice started for dinner. And I would always ask her, well, how many go am I cooking? Because I didn't know how many people were coming over for dinner. Now, before the age of plastic cups, this is the vessel that you would use to measure rice, and you still see these fairly commonly. They're also sold for measuring sake, as I said, and there's a measuring tape next to it to give you a feel for how big it is. Those are centimeters, not inches. Here's another example. This is rice for sale, and you'll notice that it gives the volume. It says volume here. What's the volume? It's 2 go. They don't tell you how many grams it is or anything like that. They tell you it's 2 go of rice. They also tell you when it was produced and who produced it. Okay, but it's rice, and therefore that's how it's measured. Now, what about the metric system? Well, the modern and official system is the metric system, and it's commonly handled with transliterations of the international units using katakana. Although, as you'll see on the next slide, there are official kanji equivalents. So a millimeter is a millimeteru, a centimeter is a centimeteru, a meter is a meteru, a kilometer is a kilometeru, etc. Areas in the metric system are usually designated as square, and the word for square is heiho. So any units that includes the word heiho implies square. So 900 heiho meitoru is 900 square meters. Now, as I just said, there are official kanji equivalents, and these are just wacky, but I thought I'd throw them in. These are also in the Nelson's appendix, and they are kokuji, in case you're wondering. These are not used in China. Somebody in Japan made them up, and they're kind of clever. So let's look at meter here. First, I'm going to go down, and then I'm going to go back up again. So a decameter, deca of course means 10, and look, they have the radical for rice because it's pronounced mi. And then on the right they have 10, so it's 10 of them, right? And then here, a hectometer, 100, a kilometer, 1,000. And up here, they're using, they don't have fraction kanji, right? So they can't do that. But they're still trying to imply something based on that traditional system. And likewise, they have the milligrams here and the liters. I got to be honest, I can't recall seeing anybody use those on a daily basis, but what the heck, I thought I'd throw them in. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about numbers and ordinals. We have been looking now at units of measure. Let's move on to numbers and ordinals. As you've probably learned in class already, Japanese numbers have more than one reading. So yon and shi are both possible readings for 4. And nana and shichi are alternative readings for 7. And the different readings are simply onyomi and kunyomi differences. But in the case of 4 and 7, we use the kunyomi more often than with other numbers. Only 4 and 7 regularly use those kunyomi. Here's the whole chart. And we've got the onyomi on the top, the kunyomi on the bottom. I've also indicated what is a kan-on and what is a go-on. And there is no to-on for the numbers. And at the bottom, there's multiple, except for the number 10, multiple possible kunyomi. None of that should come as a surprise to you. Of course, it doesn't happen in China. Some measure words, notably nin, gatsu, ka or nichi, ji, and jikan, take certain alternatives only, like you don't have a choice. So you say yonin and you say shigatsu. You never say yogatsu or yongatsu. That's not a word. It's shigatsu. That is the standard usage. Those really, there's only one way to learn them, and that is to memorize them. But as you've probably also found out, in other situations, sometimes you're free to use either alternative. You could use either the onyomi or the kunyomi, and native speakers won't blink. It sounds perfectly fine to them. Another unique aspect to East Asian numeration is the use of measure words. These exist in Chinese also. And they are really necessary when referring to a number of objects. English only does this in certain idiomatic cases when we're referring to specific categories. So in the English phrase 3 head of cattle, for example, the word head is the measure word. But there's a lot of expressions in English or sentences that you could construct that enumerate but don't need a counter, a measure word. So for example, I could say, I have 5 books on my desk. I don't have a counter word there. But I could say there are 3 head of cattle out in the field. I could also just say there are 3 cows out in the field and then get away without having that measure word. So English is pretty flexible about that, but Japanese is not. In Japanese, you must put in that measure word or else it sounds weird. So here's some examples. Many of these should be familiar to you. So if an object is a long like a stick, then it's a hon. So for example, empitsu gohon is 5 pencil, 5 cylindrical things. The counter for animals, mammals for the most part, is hiki or biki. So inu 3 biki is 3 dogs. The counter for people is pretty easy. It's nin. Kodomo 4 nin. 4 children. The counter for birds is wa. Niwatori 3 wa. 3 birds, 3 chickens. The counter for ships is so. Yoto 3 so. The counter for vehicles is dai. So kuruma 1 dai is 1 car. The counter for flat flat things, flat and actually usually flexible things, like a piece of paper or here a playing card, is mai. Torampu nimai is 2 playing cards. This is most certainly not an exhaustive list, and you can find really big, long lists of these counters. You can find them on the internet, you can find them in dictionaries. Just as a quick example, I'll show you, this is what the Wikipedia page for those counters looks like. So the word for counter word, or measure word in Japanese is josushi. You can use that as a search term on the internet and find all kinds of information about them. This Wikipedia page does it through IUO order and provides lots of different examples of different counter words. I should say that the better you get at counter words, the more fluent your Japanese sounds, so there's a real incentive for focusing on that. Now, what about if you just don't know the right measure word and you can't not have one? Well, the good news is there's kind of a way to fudge it, and that is there's sort of this generic counter, tsu, and you can use that in some cases. So hitotsu just means one of something, just like futatsu, mitsu, yotsu, itsutsu, mutsu, nanatsu, yatsu, kokonotsu, and to. And if you, depending on what you're saying, I can't think of a great example sentence, but you might find that it's better to use this generic, which is ko. The ko just means like a thing, like a lump of something. So ikko is 1 something. It might sound funky to use ikko with, let's say, people, because a person isn't a lump of something, it's animated. But that's better than not having any measure word whatsoever. Okay, let's move away from measure words and look at large numbers. My apologies for that technical difficulty. We might call it, we might call these large numbers, or not call them large numbers, but call this part of the lesson focusing on how numbers are written. So as you already know, the counting system used in East Asian languages divides numbers. And what I mean by divide number, I mean when we write them on the page, where do we put the commas? What our first grade teachers used to call the tens column, or the hundreds column, or the thousands column. So that method of dividing numbers is different in East Asia from the Western custom. So in European languages, we have 2 clear divisions for the most common numbers, thousands and millions. So we'll put a comma after 1,000, and we'll put a comma after 1,000,000. But I'm hoping you know already that in East Asian languages, Chinese, Korean, Japanese, that division is different. East Asian languages take 10,000 as that first division. The next division comes at the 100 million level. That's called an oku. And then a trillion, which is called a cho. At that point, you might think, oh, why would I ever have to know an oku or a cho? I never use numbers that are that big. But if you want to read a newspaper, particularly something about the economy, then the Japanese economy, then you're going to have to know oku and cho because they're always talking about how many yen are doing whatever. And certainly yen is a very small unit of money. And so you end up with these really large numbers. And they're not going to write them out for you in the newspaper. They're simply going to be using the kanji. So, for example, here is a web page of the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, and or in the market section here, and you'll see this link refers to an oku, san oku, and this link down here also about sandori, it has that character oku in it. So if we chart this, we see in the middle the units of measure we should be familiar with and their equivalents over on the right hand side. And then I'm going to color code it for you so you can sort of see what's going on. So the units that are unique to East Asia on this chart are green, and the units that are unique to the West are white. What I mean by unique is we have one word for it. We see that as a unit, so we see a million as a distinct, discrete unit. Whereas the Japanese would look at that number, 10 to the 6th, and not think of it as a discrete unit. They think of it as 100 mon, right? And the rows that are orange are units that the East and the West have in common. So after we get out of 1,000, which there is a discrete word for, even though when you're writing it in Japanese you don't put a comma there, the only other overlap up till 10 to the 24th is a trillion and a septillion. Incidentally, there is stuff above this level of Jo, and if you want to find it, you can find it on the chart, the online chart, to which I have a link on Blackboard that gives you units of measure. Here is that web page, and if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see we were just looking at these numbers. The top one on my chart was a Jo, but you can go much higher up into numbers. I really can't imagine why you would need them. My very favorite one is the Fukashigi up here. It's a great name. And Murio Daisu, in other words, big numbers that can't be quantified. So there really are huge numbers, and these kanji, once you get up to above octillion, you start having phrases instead of individual kanji. But if you see those kanji, then you'll know what they're talking about, those huge, huge numbers. What about fractions? One of the great things about fractions in Japanese is that they're easy. So many things in Japanese are hard, but fractions are easy. So I thought I'd put this in there and make you feel sort of empowered. The way that you express a fraction in Japanese is really straightforward. I'm not going to start with half because half's sort of an exception. It's hanbun. But let's say you want to say a third. You say sanbun no ichi. Incidentally, 2/3 would be sanbun no ni. You might be able to guess that, right? A fourth, yonbun no ichi. And you can see that that is consistent all the way down the chart. So any fraction can be expressed that way as long as you know how to say the number in the denominator. Then you know you're good to go. Well, I suppose you need to know the number in the numerator too, but that's not that hard. Okay, how about what I'm going to call bankers' numbers? This is just a term that I made up for this lecture. I don't think you could easily Google it and find what you're looking for. But here's what I mean. When you're minting money, when you're printing money or you're writing checks, and producing other monetary documents, for the same reason that in English we write out the amounts longhand, like we see here in this illustration. You're writing a check, so you write 256 and 27/100ths. We do that so that the check cannot be easily forged. And it's not uncommon to use especially complex numerical characters or kanji that cannot be easily altered in the Japanese or the Chinese context, because after all, it would be really easy to take this ichi and change it into a ni. Double my money. So that could be a big problem. Here I'm going to show you the numbers, the special kanji that are used to prevent this kind of forgery. The pronunciation of the kanji is the same as the sort of standard kanji like this ni that we see on the screen right now. Here they are, 1 through 5. So this kanji is pronounced ichi. And there's two variables of this. There's that one and then this one also. Ni, you could write it like this, or you could write it like this. Now that would be hard to forge. That's a lot of strokes there. San is written like this. And you'll notice that in some of these cases, for example, in the case of san, this kanji has been repurposed, if you will. This kanji has its own important meaning. You may recognize it from the word, for example, sanka, to participation, sanka no san, or maeru, to go. So it's being repurposed for its onyomi. Its onyomi is san, and so and it would be very hard to forge, and so that's what it's being used for. Yon, go. 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now, in addition to 1 through 10, there's a couple other odds and ends that I'll introduce to you, numbers that kanji that represent numbers that you might not be familiar with. There's 20, 30, 20, 30, 100, and sen. So let me show you some examples of these in real life. This is a bill, and of course it's got the Arabic numerals on it, so we know immediately what it is. It's 2,000 yen, but you'll notice here that the 2 is one of those complex 2's, and then we have sen, en. Here's the 10,000 yen note with my buddy Fukuzawa Yukichi there. So it is ichiman. We have that ichi right there, ichiman en. These are old bills from pre-war days. The top one is 10 yen, and the bottom one is 1 yen. Oh, okay, the exchange rate was really different back then. A yen was worth a whole lot more, and yes, there were 1 yen notes. And this also is a pre-war script, and we see this is 10, ju, n, the complex character for n, of course, because this is printed before 1945. And you might think, well, okay, so it shows up on money. Where else might it show up? Well, just to be a little bit silly, I'll say that you know, you can find these characters in all sorts of places, like here. So there's a photo of a toy, and we have ichi, ni, san down the back of it. Finally, I want to address numbered list or ordinals. In the same way that we use various numbering systems in English, so we might have ABC, 1, 2, 3 in Roman numerals, 1, 2, 3 in Arabic numerals. The Japanese have, they use various systems. They have a lot of choice in what they want to use. So 1, 2, 3, ichi, ni, san, that seems pretty clear. Aiueo, based on the Goju Onzu. Iroha, based on the Iroha, and we've seen Iroha certainly in dictionaries. And finally, going back to the heavenly stems, we have ko, tsu, hei, etc. Okay, so this is not only part of the sexagenary cycle, But the heavenly stems are also commonly used as a system of hierarchy. That's what I mean by a numbered list. And it's not just in printed matter like dictionaries that you might find this. Here's an example in everyday life. This is a sign for roasted sweet potatoes, yakiimo, and the best of them, and also the most expensive of them, 280 yen for 100 grams, is labeled as the kohl. It's the best. It's the best. It's the top. And then otsu is next. That one's 240 yen, and then the hay is only 200 yen for 100 grams. So you could walk into a store, for example, and see a sign like this. You say to yourself, "Oh, that's one, A, B, C, or 1, 2, 3, the best, the next best, the first place, second place, third place," kind of thing. All right, so that's numbers and ordinals and units of measure and all things mathematical. That's the end for us to do in terms of math for this course. So if you're a math phobe, you can breathe a sigh of relief. In the homework, I am going to ask you to do some very simple math, and you can use a calculator if you need to. I don't care. But that's not really the point of the homework. The point of the homework is to see if you can find the resources that you need to define different units of measure.